710 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the iron microphone. The science behind everything that you see, I don't even know if I can call it scientific conservatism anymore. It's basically scientific libertarianism. Streaming live on KURV.com, 1-800-580-8255, 1-800-580-TALK. Hot off the press. Visit 710 KRV, what? Cooks? Cook? 710 KRV Cook. 710 KRV invites you to make a difference in a child's life and help fight cancer in the Rio Grande Valley. Visit KURV.com right now and click on the Vanny Cook 2013 Radiothon banner to make a donation. Call 1-855-571-5437 or stop by the R Communications Studios at 1201 North Jackson in McAllen. A good cause. There aren't many around, so that's one of them. So maybe, don't buy your 50-cent album today and maybe give some money to help the children stricken with cancer in the Rio Grande Valley. The airwaves are full recently with government trying to confiscate the means of self-defense of the American people. The Second Amendment, as I've related many times, exists to defend the American people from the American government. The Bill of Rights cannot be interpreted by the government. Each of the 10 Bill of Rights is a single sentence for those of you who haven't bothered to read it in a while. Every right is a single sentence. It is meant to be understood by every American, regardless of level of education. It's very, very basic. And the Second Amendment says that a well-regulated militia, in order to keep the security of a free state, that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That's pretty easy to understand, isn't it? I mean, what do they mean by a free state? It means a state unencumbered by the tyranny of a central government. A well-regulated militia means what? It does not mean well-controlled. It means a militia that is proficient and capable. To be proficient and capable requires being versed in methods of self-defense, including the right to keep and bear arms. The government has no say as to our rights as citizens, other than to guarantee those rights. It cannot interpret the Second Amendment. It cannot change the Second Amendment. It cannot apply its own rationale to anything. The Second Amendment was not made for hunters or for profit or for recreation. It was made exclusively to protect the American people from the American politician. Government is the source of all great evil. No matter what the problem is, if it's of a great nature, great evil, large evil, unmitigated evil, it is government. Only government can commit war. Only government can commit mass murder. Only government can institutionalize slavery. Only government can create poverty. Only government can create concentration camps. Only government can inflict genocide. No other entity is capable of doing so. Almost everything government does is evil. And the reason government exists is to promote evil. Government exists primarily for its own sake. It wishes to enslave for its own benefit. Government protects a nation not to protect the people, but protect itself. Governments really only exist because of conflicts with other government. Let's take a look at the illogic of the gun debate, and it is incredibly illogical. But with a nation of bobbleheads has been created by our system of education, we all just sit around bobbling our heads to the nonsense spewed out by the propaganda arm of the government, referred to as the mass media and system of public education. The repeated nostrum that if there were less guns, there would be less gun violence is completely false. And like much of what the government says, what it actually says is opposite of what is true. There are those who wish to ban all guns, and they say that all guns, if we remove all guns, we would remove all gun violence. That doesn't necessarily mean we would remove all violence, but that is something we can discuss. Logically, then, if it is the availability of guns, which is directly correlated with violence, with homicide, with murder, gun violence, then why is it that those areas in the United States which make it most difficult to own and possess guns are the regions with the most violence? Los Angeles, Miami, Chicago, Detroit, most urban centers which make it difficult or impossible to own guns or to carry guns around or to have guns available. Why are these the areas with the highest rates of murder, with the highest rates of violence? One would expect it to be the opposite. Let's look at some hard numbers. In the United States, there were about 11,000 homicides by firearms. 65% of those were committed by blacks and Hispanics. Of course, they were perpetrated primarily on blacks and Hispanics as well. 65% of murders are committed by blacks or Hispanics, which constitute only 25% of the population. There are those out there who then would assert that it is something to do with blacks and Hispanics particularly, but that is really not the case. The real case is that gun ownership by whites is double that of blacks. We're going to get this discussion here. If gun ownership by whites is double that of blacks, then why is there not more crime committed by whites than by blacks in as far as a proportion? Though whites own guns double the rate of blacks commit 7 times more murder with firearms than do whites. But an important consideration is missing. The important consideration is the ratio of criminals that own weapons, guns, compared to the ratio of non-criminals that own guns. In the black community, the ratio of criminals that own guns compared to the non-criminals that own guns is the highest among any group. The reason there's so much crime in the black community is not because there's a prevalence of guns, because there is less prevalence of guns in the black community than in the white community. The reason there is so much crime in the black community is that the innocent, hardworking black individual is made a sacrificial lamb to the criminal element. And they have no means of self-defense. And that is why there's so much crime in the black neighborhood. Now, the real source of crime is government. The real source of violence and a threat of violence is government. Gun control is racially motivated and always has been. Governments always try to reduce the amount of weaponry among the minority population because it's the minority population which is usually the most disaffected. In the United States, gun violence is related to socioeconomic conditions. And what is it that creates poverty in the United States? Well, poverty in the United States is directly related to being raised in a single-parent family. and having a lack of education. And those two problems are the most egregious in the black community, and they are created by the government. It is the government that creates an environment in the black community in which businesses cannot survive, in which one is threatened by violence and criminal activity all the time, in which drug dealing is considered to be an acceptable means of income, and all the violence associated with that. Violence in the black community is directly related to government programs of welfare, food stamps, aid to dependent children, and all the other benefits that government, or so-called benefits government, provides. Welfare in the black community has resulted in an out-of-wedlock pregnancy rate that has gone from 20% in 1950 to 75% in 2010. 50% of all black women's pregnancies end up in the premature termination of the infant's life, referred to as the abortion of pregnancy. This, of course, makes it appear that life is meaningless in the black community. All of these programs are sponsored by, promoted by, created by government for the benefit of government. And so, to recap the absurdity of the government's position on gun control, the government says that the more guns available, the more gun crimes committed. This is entirely false. It's exactly the opposite. In areas where gun control is strict, you have the greatest amount of violence. Gun violence. In areas where gun control doesn't exist, you have the least amount of violence, least amount of criminal violence. The reason that there's so much murder in the black community is not because of the excess availability of guns, but because of the denial of means to defend themselves by the majority of black individuals from their criminal element, which is allowed to run rampant in the community. The criminal element in the black community is directly related to its socioeconomic condition, which is created by the government. Socioeconomic condition that says that the two greatest factors in promoting a criminal life is being born into a single-parent family and a lack of education. Both of those problems are government-created in the black community. And so that is the real source of problem. Exactly opposite of what the government says, but of course the government has an ulterior motivation. The institutionalization of discrimination is anti-constitutional, but is the way the government functions. Blacks and Hispanics are segregated from society purposefully in preventing them from assimilating, because an assimilation in American society is what's necessary for success. So in order to keep blacks and Hispanics dependent upon the government, it is necessary that they not assimilate. So the government creates programs to prevent assimilation. Black family, it promotes out-of-wedlock pregnancy and abortion. Hispanics, it does the same thing, as well as programs such as bilingual education. It promotes segregation through racism promoted by the government, which the government asserts that the low socioeconomic level of blacks and Hispanics is due to racism, when in fact it is due to government policies that result in out-of-wedlock pregnancies and lack of education, and community, which is crime-ridden, and is very difficult to thrive in a community that is crime-ridden. Separatism is the goal of the government, because separatism keeps the American people divided and weak, and it extends that separatism throughout all our society. The institutionalization of discrimination through Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, affirmative action, quotas, set-asides, bilingual education, all of these serve to divide our society and strengthen the government by pitting one group against another. The Constitution does not permit the institutionalization of racism and separatism, but government programs create the environment that does that anti-constitutionally. Total violence in any society is pretty much the same. Violence, which affects the society, is essentially the most important part of it is the threat of violence. Clearly, a small minority of a population, even if it's considered a large group, if you have a high murder rate of 4 per 100,000 versus a low murder rate of 1 per 100,000, the vast majority in either sense is still not going to be exposed to murder. In the United States, there are something like $15,000 persons murdered a year in a population of 300 million. Certainly a very, very tiny percentage. So therefore, it is the perception of crime which is more important than the crime itself for the vast majority of people. It is the threat of violence which is much more important than actual violence. The combination of threat of violence and violence is the same throughout all societies. The difference only is who directly applies the violence or the threat of violence. In totalitarian states, there is oftentimes not very much actual violence, but the threat of violence is very, very high. In the Soviet Union, there may have been not that many murders when the Soviet Union was at its, civilian murders, but there were plenty of government-inspired murders. It was the threat of government violence which deterred private violence. Other societies, the private violence is promoted by government as well. When I say private violence, I mean privately instigated by private. The private sector actually does the violence, but of course it is always instigated by government in one form or another. In Venezuela, they talk about the improvement of, it's a lie, but let's say the improvement of socioeconomic condition by Hugo Chavez in that country, but the massive increase in violent crime. They can't figure it out. They can't figure out why there's a massive increase in violent crime. At the same time, there's an improvement in socioeconomic status that would appear to be self-contradictory. Well, the reason is that the violence is so high in Venezuela is because the government sponsors the violence. The only ones allowed to own weapons in Venezuela are government-sponsored gangs of criminals. They impose violence on the society and the threat of violence, and it only occurs because of government promotion. It may not be done directly by government forces, but by government-supported forces. The division in the society of those able to bear arms and those who are not able to bear arms, the ones that bear arms are the ones the government allows to bear arms, specifically because of the divisiveness that results from that type of behavior. Equality in defense would provide security for a nation, but equality in defense is not permitted by most governments because government wants to either be the sole source of so-called defense or determine who can be defended and who cannot. So the government either applies a reign of terror, as it does in North Korea or China or other places, which tends to decrease individual violence, or it applies the means for certain groups within a society to receive weaponry, which will allow the infliction of directly, privately instigated, but indirectly promoted government violence upon society. If one understands that all problems in society come from government, that all great evil comes from government, then one can finally try to figure out exactly why crime rates are what they are. Government-imposed violence or threat of violence is not considered criminal activity because criminal activity is dictated by government. Why is drug dealing a criminal activity in the United States and many other places? Because government has autocratically and arbitrarily determined that the trade in some drugs will be illegal, whereas in other drugs it is not. In the United States, there are many, many powerful medications which are considered legally distributed, whereas others are not considered illegally distributed. That's not hard to know which those are. The illegally distributed is cocaine, is marijuana, medication, drugs like that. More sanctioned medication can be illegal if it's done through non-prescribed means. Who determines the laws of prescription medications? Government. And so therefore, in the United States, criminal activity is defined by what government defines as criminal activity. At one time, taking cocaine and selling cocaine was perfectly legal. Now it is illegal. The activity is the same. The consequences are the same as far as the taking of the medication or a drug. The only difference is that in one case it is considered legal, another illegal by government arbitrariness. So crime is created by government. Crime statistics are created by government. Government is the criminal. However, when government does criminal activity, it is not considered criminal activity because government decides what is criminal. Going to war is criminal, but the government says it's legal. Therefore, it's not considered criminal activity. If going to war was considered criminal activity, what entity is the greatest criminal, if not the government? How many people does the American government kill legally, abroad or anywhere else? How many thousands of people are killed by American government legally? But it's not considered murder because it's considered legal. The homicide is homicide. And the action of homicide is identical whether it is legal or illegal. What makes it illegal or illegal is the way government defines homicide and murder. The killing of a human being is the killing of a human being, whether it is justifiable or unjustifiable. The problem is it is the government that determines what is justified and what is not. And so violence in society is basically directly related to government. If everyone in the United States was armed, if every adult in the United States was armed, there would be very little murder in the United States. If that were not the case, why is it that most murder is perpetrated by the armed against the unarmed? Why is very little murder perpetrated by the armed against the armed? Don't you find that interesting? Is it just luck or happenstance? Or do you suppose that the armed criminal purposefully targets those he or she considers as unarmed? Isn't that why so much murder is done in places which are notorious for being unprotected by armed individuals? Schools, malls, theaters. The government doesn't care about the people other than how the people can serve the government. And so the government creates environments which exist for no other reason than to perpetuate government rule. How are governments overthrown? Usually through violence. Therefore, how do the governments stay in power? Through violence or threat of violence. Why do you pay your taxes? If you were not, if you were given the option to pay a Social Security tax or not pay a Social Security tax, would you pay it? Most would not. Why do you? Because you trust government? Because you think that it's a benefit? Or is it because if you don't pay it, you go to jail? And so most of us pay our Social Security, but look at the way it is. The violence is so ingrained, or the threat of violence is so ingrained as part of our national psyche, we don't even recognize it as such. Why do you pay a sales tax? Because if you don't, you go to jail. Why do you pay your income tax? Because if you don't, you go to, or you're either jail or some other threat of government, some other infliction of government threat of violence, whether that violence is physical or material. The government forcibly will take away what you have, including your life, and people understand that, which is why we pay taxes willingly, so-called. We don't even recognize that the reason we pay taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, income taxes, Social Security tax, Medicare tax, franchise tax, all other kinds of taxes, the reason we do so is because of the threat of violence if we don't, threat of government-imposed violence. And so government functions through violence or threat of violence. Everything the government does is through violence or threat of violence. So if the government, and if the government doesn't care about you except as a slave, let's just get down to basics. If the government exists through violence or threat of violence, and everything the government, the reason government exists is to enslave for its own benefit, then we start understanding what is really going on here. So in the United States, when the government says they want to confiscate weapons, why is that? Because the government wants to protect itself. The government wants to protect itself. The government perfectly is aware that the criminal element will obtain weapons or not. As the guiltless or the average citizen is denied right of self-defense, that individual will become a greater target through the criminal element. The government will present itself as the source of security, but it does so simply to lure the people into believing that the government can protect you from the violent elements of society, when the violent elements of society are created by the government itself. Poverty is created by the government, as we've already stated. Therefore, the criminal element in the United States is created by government. Those in poverty, those in the illicit trade of drug dealing. Why is there so much violence in drug dealing? Because the government has created an environment which requires violence in order to continue. People want to buy drugs, and therefore people will sell those drugs. And because the government has made it illegal to do so, making it a criminal offense, is therefore now violence is now associated with the dealing of drugs. A violence which would disappear overnight if drugs were legalized. Violence would disappear overnight in the drug dealing trade. This is 710 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. Be back after this short commercial break. We're back. 710 KRV Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. 1-800-580-8255, 1-800-580-TALK, streaming live on KURV.com. Violence or the threat of violence is what keeps government in power. In a tyranny, the threat of violence or the violence is imposed by government. Because it is imposed by government, it is not considered officially as criminal activity. But the violence is there nevertheless. Government-imposed violence is always the greatest source of all violence in one form or another. If the government does not impose the violence or threat of violence directly, it creates a society which is violent by creating disequilibrium in levels of wealth and levels of education, or by creating laws which segregate society. Government promotes violence and the threat of violence. Internally, it does so through restrictions on self-defense, through creating an environment of poverty, or through creating divisions within a society. You want to create violence in society, divide society. Human beings are the same. It really doesn't matter what color of skin or what language you speak. We are all the same. Yet, government has created an environment which says that groups will be segregated according to skin color, according to gender, according to age. And when you do that, that requires discrimination. Medicare discriminates against those under 65. Medicaid discriminates against those who have a certain higher level of income. Bilingual education discriminates those who don't speak Spanish. And so government discriminates one group educational levels through affirmative action. Says that some should receive more benefits than others for no other reason than the color of their skin or the language in which they speak or their age. The reason that those in Medicare are benefited is for no other reason than of age. Those who receive Medicaid receive benefits for no other reason than of their level of education, a level of economic status. That is arbitrarily defined discrimination. And when you have discrimination, you have conflict. Conflict between those who receive and those who do not. Conflict between those who are funded and those who do the funding. These are discriminations arbitrarily created and created by government specifically to divide the nation and to keep the government in power. Republican or Democrat, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who's in charge because the political class circles the wagons and defends itself against the American people, against the people in general, because it is always the government against the people. If the government were not always against the people, then the government would not need to impose violence on the people in order to stay in power. And if you do not believe that government imposes violence or a threat of violence on the American people in order to stay in power, then go and don't pay your income tax and see what happens. Try to buy a little bit of cocaine and see what happens. We have John calling from somewhere. 7 KRV, thanks for calling, John. What do you have to say?
Well, all these programs that the government starts, they have good intentions at one time, but everything gets out of hand.
Wait a minute. Wait a minute. Why do you say they're good intentions? Let's take a look
at. Well, they weren't good intentions. It's a power grab.
Well, sure, they were never good intentions. Let's look at Medicare. Medicare is for those 65 and older. When it was implemented, there was no benefits for anyone 65 or older in health care, and there were very few Americans who were 65 or over. So it was a political deal. Same thing with Social Security. When Franklin Roosevelt created Social Security, the average life expectancy of an American was 64 years of age. When does Social Security kick in? 65. Come on. These politicians are just a bunch of cynical crooks. Okay, what else?
It is.
Yeah.
And then, of course, what we have now, they have declared that this one, Obamacare, is a tax. So, I mean, if you don't pay it in the penalty phase, then you don't have insurance, but you pay a penalty because you don't have insurance.
Right, it's referred to, it's a tax. They refer to it as a tax. That's what government does. Government wants to control your health care because government wants to enslave the American people. And so that's what the Affordable Care Act is. Nothing
plan on this too. People forget that.
Well, they never knew it to begin with because the system of public education makes sure that that the reality is well concealed behind a blather of ignorant teachers and professors.
And then this current president and vice president, well, they are taking a vacation now, or one of them is. Wow.
Well, you know, it's interesting you bring that up. If you look at the life of your typical aristocrat and the life of Barack Obama, it's exactly the same. I mean, all an aristocrat does is pamper themselves at the expense of the peasant class. And this guy, Barack Obama, takes more vacation and has spent more money on himself probably than all other presidents combined. And this guy he thinks he's an aristocrat.
Something like Marie Antoinette and her husband.
Are you talking about Michelle Obama? If there's a Marie Antoinette in our society, it's Michelle Obama.
That's right.
It's just incredible. What a bunch of idiots the nation has become. Anything else?
Well, yeah, but there's people vote for people like that.
Oh, yeah? 64 million parasites voted for Barack Obama. There are 250 million American people. What happened to the other 190 million American people? 190 million Americans did not vote for Barack Obama. You know, if you look at our society, what would you say? About 25% to 40% are parasites. Okay? Well, that's who votes for Barack Obama. Barack Obama is the king of parasites. And they've elected him. Why did they elect Barack Obama? Because he's going to give them cell phones. He's going to give them money. He's going to give them food stamps. He's going to give them unemployment checks. So the parasites have taken over control of the government. Well, when parasites take over the control of an organism, the organism doesn't have long to survive.
Oh yeah, it's just like put 100 wood ticks on you and then suck the lifeblood out of you. Same principle.
Yeah, I think I'll avoid that, however. Anything else?
No, that's it.
Okay, thanks a lot. Thanks for calling. So the parasites are in control of the government. How do parasites function? Through violence. And that's what our government is, one gigantic parasite that's imposing its will through violence. What else can be said about that? I mean, I think the human psychology is really so quite interesting. How the government can just tell you the opposite of what's true, and we accept it, the bobbleheads that so many are, as being legitimate, as being true. The system of public education exists to make sure everybody is ignorant. So they call the system of public education. Talk about 1984. The war against poverty, guaranteed poverty. Food stamps guarantees obesity. I mean, it's just kind of amazing. I mean, the gun control guarantees gun violence. Let's just anything. Department of Defense, always at war. Social Security guarantees poverty. What should we? Anything anyone can think of, whatever the government says, we're going to be. The function is exactly the opposite of what the government says. So the war against drugs makes sure that criminal activity grows. So anyway, I'm not sure if everybody can understand all of this, but it's pretty. You think about it for a while, it always goes down to the very basics, and the basics are, or the basic principle is that all great wrong is done by government. Only government can create great wrong, whether it's mass starvation, poverty, war, concentration camps, slavery, or genocide. It can only be done through government action. The Constitution prevents the institutionalization of inequality. But society spends all of its time creating an environment noted for being divisive. But as I said earlier, we are all the same. And all the differences are cultural and arbitrary, imposed by government or other source of authority. But we're all human beings. If there is more crime in the black community, if there is more crime created by blacks, it's not because they're black. It's because of the culture that has been created by government. But then the government makes it appear that we ought to be afraid of blacks because of the high rate of crime. Yet 95% of crime perpetrated by blacks, the victims are 95% of the time black. Who should have greater fear of crimes committed by blacks than blacks themselves? Same in the Hispanic community. The vast majority of crimes committed by Hispanics are on Hispanics. Well, the same thing's in the white community. Actually, the white community has more to fear from the white community than from the black community. Most of the crime committed upon whites are by whites. It's just a question of ratio. The ratio is simply that if you are if you're a white person in a black community, you're much more likely to be have crime inflicted on you than if you're a white person in a white community. It's just a question of the odds. But the fact of the matter is, the reason there's so much crime in the black community is because the government has created an environment which promotes crime in the black community. And who suffers most? The blacks themselves. But that is what government wants to create. And so that's what there is. And the government and the media and the system of public education are all a bunch of liars in order to try to create the impression of differences, intrinsic differences between communities, which there are none. There are created differences. There are no intrinsic differences. And the government uses those created differences to keep us divided and at each other's throats in order to justify government existence. So I think, I don't know how else to say it. I don't know how many different ways I can say it. You're going to need to think about it for a little bit, and you'll understand that it is government that is the great source of evil in the world, always has been, and because the reason governments came into existence was so that a few gangsters could control the majority around them. You understand that the reason government came into existence to begin with was in order for the minority to enslave the majority. Then maybe things become a little clearer and the fog lifts and we have a better understanding of what government actually is. Why else then in countries such as Cuba, North Korea, and China is it a criminal offense to say anything against the government, let alone do anything, but say anything? Such is the way governments are. So that's our bit. Let's move to something a little more fun. Even though overthrowing the government might be fun, but we'll put that on the back burner. Lately, I've had a little bit of discussion, little travelogues. I'm not a great world traveler, but I do think that history is important. Not that it's important to know the dates and times of anything, but to know the reasons why the Civil War was fought. Had nothing to do with slavery, but with the conflict between northern states and southern states and the attempt of a fascist Abraham Lincoln to impose fascist ideology on the nation. That was the Civil War. Nothing to do with slavery. And so it's important. So I try to discuss the nature of things, the true understanding of the way things are, so we'll get a better understanding of who we are. So history is not important for when or where a battle or a conflict or an event occurred historically. Much, much more important is why and the underlying motivations. I believe, therefore, that travel through other parts of the world to get a visual representation of their history is important to better understand ourselves as human beings. When you go to another country and you look at, superficially at least, at some of the events, and you'll notice that, these events seem to be so similar to events in our country, just the names are different. One political group attacking another, wars, conflict, all kinds of issues, societal issues. And the amazing thing is how similar it is from one country to the next. We all tend to think of ourselves as somehow different when in reality that we're not. And once we realize that we're not, then we can discover, here you have these political conflicts in Chile. People knocking each other off for political reasons. And it's so similar to what happens in our country, but we don't know the names of the people. We don't know the dates or the events or anything like that. But what we do recognize is the similarity of the event itself. And so therefore, it starts to dawn upon one that, here you have this conflict between these two guys of different names, these two parties with different names. And then you had the conflict in our country, different names, issues, titles, whatever, politics. And you say, it seems to be underlying everything. There seems to be a certain sameness to it all. The sameness is conflict between one little group, one group against another, and both groups led by a small number of people. or 3 groups, but it doesn't matter. That the large group is run by a small number of people that dictates the actions of the group, regardless of what those actions are and the reasons behind it. And you start seeing, well, it always seems to be power. Underneath everything is power. The reason why, just that hodgepodge of different reasons, but the underlying motivation always seems to be the same, the assertion of power. And so the more we know about the way history is and the way other countries are, the better understanding we'll have of ourselves. That's really the point of it all. And when one goes to Europe, or many other countries, I imagine, one will often find that the greatness of that nation, which we go visit, France is beautiful, England, Spain, or whatever. And we find that the greatness and the beauty in so many of these countries is in the past. If one goes to Italy and says, the Colosseum, the St. Peter's, all these great artifacts of art, sculpture, that exist there is from the past. Modern Italy is a dump. Modern France is a dump. Modern, pretty much everything is a dump. But we don't go there. We go to the Louvre. We go to Notre Dame. We go to the Eiffel Tower. We don't go traveling around outside much. Or if we go to Chartres, or we go to where Monet lived or something, that's all the past. If one looks at France, modern France, it's a dump. People are unhappy because they're poor, because they have no options, because you have the rich, small group of the rich and the government, which is the same, and you have the vast majority of people without independence, without money, with nothing. And that's the way it is in Italy, France, in England, in so many other countries. And so when we go to Europe and we talk about how beautiful Europe is, we're talking about either the wealthy today, where the wealthy hang out, the Riviera. It's not where the average French person hangs out. And or the beauty of the past. But not the people of today. What do we got here? We got Jack, 7 KRV. Thanks for calling, Jack. What do you have to say?
Dr. Gelman,
yeah.
Your discussion of history brought to mind this idea that we don't have to look very far back in history to see what happens when a federal government collapses. We can just look at the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And what happened was the individual states then basically took control of their own resources, their own countries. And I expect that sort of thing will happen here. However, I expect to see a tremendous fight being put up by the U.S. federal government. And Americans have to understand that the U.S. federal government is not America, and America is not the U.S. federal government, and that a collapse of the U.S. federal government is not a collapse of America. It's not a collapse of our way of life. It's a collapse of a corrupted entity. You can go all the way back to the Roman Empire. Now, when the Roman Empire collapsed, what people don't seem to realize is that there were societies, nascent societies developing. And it turns out that the Christian societies that were around are the ones that seem to have developed to the point where we are today, when we have Western civilization.
Well, it's interesting that you bring up Rome and the history of Rome, and if you look at the way people lived in Rome from its beginnings to its end, 1,000 years, there really wasn't much advancement, was there? There was pretty much everybody lived. You pretty much lived the way you did in 500 BC as 500 AD. Beyond that, there wasn't much change for another, almost 700 or 800 years. But then we started to have advancement, better understandings, better, and leading to the Industrial Revolution and all that. So the question arises, why is it that society was so stagnant for so long, 2,000 years, 3,000 years? And then all of a sudden, in the history, if you look at a time scale, the advances came on relatively quickly. And it came on relatively quickly associated with the increasing liberty of the individual. If you look at all the great inventions, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's the automobile, the airplane, the printing press, whatever it happens to be, all the great advances in society, none of them were created by government, were they? No politician ever invented anything worth, except for maybe the concentration camp. So, and genocide. These are what government creates, okay? Government creates slavery, concentration camps, mass murder, war. That's what government creates. No government ever created a vaccine or a computer or the automobile. I mean, every one of those things was created by individuals acting outside of government. The reason that we started having these advances was when the breakdown of an overriding authority.
Right.
So, and that's in our, the greatest advances in American society on a relative basis were at the time the government had the least control. The more control the government has over a society, there's no advances. Cuba, Russia, China. I mean, even China's economic improvements have been nothing but a perpetuation of Western industrial inventiveness. There's nothing original coming out of China. They just copy what we have. But originality and creativity can only come from a free mind. And
doctor,
yeah,
may I say this, that originality and freedom are based on the idea of individuality, the sacredness of the individual, and that started with the Jews. The Jews brought us the idea, the ancient Hebrews brought us the idea of the individual and the one God. Once they understood there was one God and they brought that concept to the world, they understood also that each of us is an individual. And then Christianity brought that even further. Hence, we have a Judeo-Christian society, which is the sum and substance of Western civilization.
All right, thanks. 7 KRV, Talkback, Dr. Lawrence Gelman. Have to. What? Back already? Am I supposed to read this again? 7 Caribbean invites you to make a difference in a child's life and help fight cancer in the Rio Grande Valley. Visit KURV.com right now. Well, not right now. And click on the Vanny Cook 2013 Radiothon banner to make a donation. Or call 1-855-571-5437, 1-855-571-5437. Stop by the Our Communications Studios at 1201 North Jackson in McAllen. For a good cause, for children that have, through no fault of their own or anyone, just the way sometimes bad luck is, that are inflicted with this disease or other misfortunes. So anything we can do to help is a good thing. So when we go to Europe to see the past and not the present, because there's nothing in the present we're seeing in Europe, as it calls, they're all a bunch of fascist dictatorships, much as the United States. You have to be somewhat creative these days when you want to go abroad because of the prices of things. So you have to look around at the best deals you can get. Traveling within Europe itself is actually very inexpensive, including airfare. For example, I was looking at a flight the other day for someone else. I was looking at the airfare from Paris to Rome. It was one way was $75. And so traveling within Europe, and that's relatively expensive. You can take a train and probably get there for less. In Italy, you can take a train from one city to another for a few dollars. The trains leave frequently. You don't even have to reserve anything. You just show up, and there's always a train leaving every hour or so to go pretty much anywhere you want to go, and not costing very much at all. $10 maybe. And so once you get to Europe, it's really relatively inexpensive. So you just got to figure out a way to get there. And once you're in Europe, it's also very inexpensive to eat. If you don't have to go to fancy restaurants. I avoid the restaurants in Europe, the regular sit-down restaurants, because usually you end up wasting an hour or 2 hours because they're in no rush. So I just go grab a sandwich or an ice cream or something, and it doesn't cost $4 or $5 to get a sandwich. And so it doesn't cost much to be in Europe if you don't want to. If you don't want to. You don't have to spend a lot of money in restaurants or food. If you really want to go inexpensively, you just go to a grocery store, buy bread, buy meat, and make your own sandwich. It came out to be like $2 a sandwich. Order some turkey and order some bread. Got great bread in Europe, by the way. Much better bread than in the United States. Great bread in Europe. It's one of the things that really amazes me, how good their bread is. And you buy bread and make a turkey or salami sandwich or whatever, some kind of, $2. It doesn't cost anything. It doesn't cost that much to, you don't have to go to a hostel. You can be civilized, and you can get it by if you look around for maybe $60 or $80 a day. And you say, well, that's not possible. Yes, it very well is possible, because all you have to do is figure out how to get from the outskirts to the inner city where most of the stuff is. So you just need to be near a metro line. So in Paris, you don't have to hang out at the West End and spend $350 or $400 a day. You can be out a little bit further and just be on a metro line, and the metro line will take you into wherever you want to see. There's even a metro stop in the Louvre Museum. So you can get by in Europe without spending a lot of money at all. You can figure out, of course, now airfares are a little bit more expensive these days, but that's the government, once again, is the taxes that have made things much more difficult to get to Europe and back than anything else. So don't blame the airline companies. You blame the taxes that are applied by the government, which the airline companies, of course, doesn't see. They have to remit that to the government. So where should we go? Let's go to Paris. You can fly from Houston to Paris nonstop, 9 hours. And go to one of the most beautiful cities that's ever created. Of course, we're talking about the old city. We're not talking about the new city. And you confine your activities between Notre Dame and the Eiffel Tower. Paris itself is a city of monuments and statues and fountains, so just walking around the city of course, it has the River Seine that goes through it. You walk through the city and you can see things which are, just the city itself is just interesting to walk through because of the architecture, at least in the old city. In the Louvre, if you're going to the museums in France, in Paris, what you want is to buy your tickets ahead of time and avoid the lines. Easy to do, doesn't cost any more, and if you buy the tickets ahead of time, you can avoid long waits in the lines because they have separate entrances for those who have already purchased their tickets. In the Louvre is where, of course, the single most famous painting in the world, I guess, is the Mona Lisa. And if you go to the Louvre, all of the signage apparently is to take you to all the arrows take you to the Mona Lisa, because we're all a bunch of bobblehead Lady Gaga people that we just want to go to what the media tells us is the most famous or the best, and therefore we as sheep go there. But there's a lot more in the Louvre than just the Mona Lisa. In fact, there's a lot more. There are a number of paintings by Da Vinci, which are in the Louvre. But to show you the way people are, you go to the Mona Lisa, and I'm one of those people, and you follow the arrows, and you up the escalator, and across the hallways, and here and there, and then you get to the Mona Lisa, and you wait in line. You don't have to wait long because people are there to see the Mona Lisa and not to appreciate it, because then they can say they saw it. And so you have to wait in line. The line goes through the little snaky little barriers and all that, and you get to look at the Mona Lisa. And now you can chalk it up in your little book saying, saw the Mona Lisa, without really appreciating what the Mona Lisa is. And not that I'm particularly great in understanding art, but I know what I like and what I don't like. Of course, some of that is dependent upon the way you grow up or what you learn. You learn to appreciate really great art, I think, best by seeing it, by looking at it, comparing it one to the other. I think that's the best way, but, what do I know about that? But I know what I like. But to show you the way people are in a different room, in fact, the gallery, I call hallway, but they call it a gallery in a museum. Those narrow rooms that connect to other narrow rooms or salons, in which they have paintings or sculpture or other things on the sides of the walls. You walk through, and there's paintings on either side, sculptures on either side of where you're walking as you go from one place to the other. And in one gallery or hallway, there's, 4, 5, 6, maybe a half dozen, one right after the other, Da Vinci paintings. Now, there aren't that many Da Vinci paintings in the world. And so to have, 5 or 6 in a row is well, you're never going to see that anywhere else. As in most galleries, they have a seating area in the middle where you can sit and look at either side at the paintings. So I'll sit there and look at the Da Vinci paintings, which are all really quite magnificent. And I'm alone. People, the same people that got in line and traipsed through the whole museum to look at the Mona Lisa walk right past another half dozen equally as impressive works without giving it a second glance. In fact, there were so many people crossing in front of me, I had to keep, it was hard to keep looking at the paintings because of all the distractions in front of me. But, why was I the only one looking at the paintings? Or one of a few? Why did the majority of people just walk past? Well, because we've all been brainwashed into thinking this is what we're seeing, and we don't really think about what it is we're seeing, just that we saw what the elitists tell us we ought to see. And much in these museums is great and to some degree unappreciated by the people walking through. So in the Louvre are great works of art. And the more you see great works of art compared to the garbage that is produced by society today, and when one looks at what it takes to create a great work of art, because the skills involved, and there are skills involved, versus tossing up a can of paint in front of a jet engine and having the paint splattered on a canvas and then selling that for $200,000, which is what's considered art today, which is why Barack Obama is president and George Bush. The more you look at great art and the more you study great art and you see what real talent is and what real beauty is, then you start to appreciate the greatness of all those who came before us. There's nothing particularly great about ourselves. There's greatness in humanity. There's potential greatness in humanity, in all humanity. You never know where it's going to come from. These great artists were great artists before they were contracted by popes and kings. It was not the Pope and the King that made the great artist. The great artists came out of something from within themselves, and then when noted to be great is when they were given contracts by popes and kings and others of wealth. I'm not aware of any king that was a great artist, not likely, or nor any politician. There may be here or there, I don't know, but sure, not offhand can I think of any great artist that was also a politician. Well, it's not going to be, because politicians and artists are opposite. The one thing a politician is not, all the things that politicians are, most of them are bad. Creativity is not one of their assets. or attributes. So if you go to Paris, you walk through the city, you go to the Louvre, and there's other things that you go see. You go see Notre Dame. Notre Dame is a wonderful thing. The architecture of Notre Dame, I think it was built somewhere in the 14th century. And so you're looking at a structure that has been seen by many millions of people, many who are no longer with us. And so you see something that exactly the same that somebody saw 100 years ago, 200 years ago, 500 years ago, pretty much identical, and that's quite a time machine. And what do you see in Notre Dame? Well, amazing architecture, domes, columns, just the architecture of the building itself. The symmetry, I mean, it's beautiful without any paintings, without any sculpture, without anything else. It's beautiful, simple in its design, simply in its design. The large arches and your eyes traveling upwards to the heavens, I suppose. The enormity of the building, but also its sense of intimacy, which I think is one of the amazing things about these old cathedrals, is how, though they are enormous in size and scope and scale, there's still an intimacy, even if you're standing there alone, as if you are communicating with the structure itself, because that is the purpose of the structure, isn't it? The large cathedral communicates that sense, the awe of connection with God, for example. And so there's an intimacy associated with it, which belies the fact of its enormous size. The genius of those who created those structures. Within you have the stained glass. Of course, you have the big rose windows or the blue windows, which were rose but became blue because of exposure to the elements. And so you have this you see the religious sculptures, the altars, the arches, the windows, all different forms of art, but all coming together with a single purpose. And so it's not a discordant view where you're seeing a bunch of discordant things, like modern art, where even within the one piece of art itself is just a chaos that makes your mind seem somehow more primitive. You go to these cathedrals where everything is aimed towards a certain purpose, and there's a coming together of a sense, because the themes are the same, thus leading to the intimacy associated with the structure and what's within the structure. So when you go, I like to go to Mass in the cathedrals because it forces me to sit down and appreciate what's there. So often we're thinking, well, I've got to go to the Notre Dame, but I got to get out of here quick because I got to go to the Louvre. And one of the things we lose is so often we lose the true beauty of of these places because we're in such a rush to see so many different things. That is why I like staying overnight in any city, because if you can remove I have to be at the plane, or I have to be at a hotel, or I'm in Rome and I have to be in Florence because of the train tomorrow, or my train leaves at 6 o'clock, or my plane leaves at 2 in the afternoon. You want to remove that. You want to be able to leisurely see what you want to see and do what you want to do, so that you don't have this time pressure. And if you can't get to the Louvre today, well, you go see it tomorrow. And so I like to go to Mass because it forces me to sit in a place for an hour at least, in which I can appreciate what's there, besides the Mass itself, of course. Now, that's additive, of course. It's additive. If you are in an institution and you are part of the functioning of the institution as it was meant to be, that just adds a little bit more to the experience. That's why I like going to places during times of festival, because much of this architecture is part and parcel of the festivities, and that just adds to the appreciation of what of what is of the works themselves, if you're able to see them function as they were meant to function. So you have you have Notre Dame, and there's nothing in the pictures that can prepare you for what you see when you're there. Being there is just different than watching it on a TV screen or looking at it in a book. You get an idea, but the emotion that one gets walking into Notre Dame, you cannot achieve through looking at a picture or a video or a TV screen. Kind of have to be there to appreciate or to get the emotional sense out of it. In Paris is something that a lot of people don't know about. A lot do, but many don't, and it's called the Sainte-Chapelle Chapel. The Sainte-Chapelle Chapel is located in the Ministry of Justice. It is the chapel within the Ministry of Justice. It was built around in the 14th century by King Louis IX or somebody who did it going off to the Crusades. And that was kind of like a dedication to the going off to the Crusades. This is a building that there's more stained glass than solid structure. On the second floor of this chapel, you have the only thing that's not stained glass is the frames holding the stained glass and the ceiling and the floor. And each window depicts a biblical scene from going in a vertical sense. So going from top to down and down to up is where the biblical scene is portrayed. Hard to see. The figures are relatively small. The roof is very high. The glass, the figures are small relative to the distance, and so that you have to look at it. So most people there need some kind of magnifying device, binoculars or something, in order to be able to discern the scenes that are being given. One walks into the building after waiting in line, unless you have your ticket beforehand, and then you don't wait in line. And you go up from the first floor up a dark staircase, and when you enter into the hall, a single hall with all the stained glasses, the cathedral itself, I guess, the first impression you get is a gigantic burst of colored light, because you're walking in from a shaded or dark area up the staircase, and then to a room which is which most of the volume of the room is lit through the stained glass windows. So you get a burst of colored light. That's the sensation that you get when you walk into the room at first, is a burst of colored light, a galaxy of light. And so you spend the time looking at the different windows and being amazed at what someone created 700 years ago. The beauty of the color, the design, the structure of the cathedral itself, and it's just awe-inspiring. So people just sit there and kind of allow the light to bathe them, to immerse them in this where you're like immersed in a bath or a sea of colored light, of stained glass. You're immersed. You're surrounded by this stained glass. It's quite something to see. I can't describe it adequately, and no picture can either. So go to Paris and see these amazing sights. You can go see the Eiffel Tower. Not that old, 120, 130 years old. Built by the same guy who I think built or designed at least the Statue of Liberty. And wander about the city and wander about it at night, and you just allow it all to kind of sink in and soak in. There's other museums. Of course, there's the Orsay Museum, which is built in an old train station, and that's more of a modern art. You have a lot of your Monets and your Van Goghs and all of that in there. And so you go to Paris, and then you allow yourself the time to stroll the city day and night, and to see the sights without rush, to take your time into different museums and seeing things other than the Mona Lisa and the Venus de Milo, and go to Notre Dame during Mass so you can enjoy it in its. You don't have to be Catholic, and enjoy it in the way it was meant to function, and see and allow you to understand the greatness, the potential greatness and the greatness as it is manifested in these works of the human soul. Because these are expressions of human ingenuity and creativity. These things are not created by animals or by the happenstance or the arbitrariness of nature. They are created through the disciplined creativity of the human soul through the human hand, manifested through the human hand in these. Is there expressions? These great works are expressions of the human soul, taking the invisible and making them visible. And that is what humankind really is, isn't it? Taking the invisible and making it visible or functional. That is what human beings can do that nothing else, no other life form can do. Taking the invisible and making us see, allowing us to see and use the invisible. So you go see Sainte-Chapelle, you see the Eiffel Tower, you go see Notre Dame, you go see the Louvre, and you go see all these great works of art. And it's an adventure going on these trips, because every day you get up and you want to see something different than you see every day, something great, something beautiful, something magnificent. So every day is an adventure. Around Paris, there are other places you can go. You can go see where Monet lived and see Monet's gardens. That's kind of a pleasant drive. Or you can go to surrounding cities like Versailles if you feel like waiting in line with a bunch of other tourists and walking through a bunch of halls. But everybody talks about, in Versailles, which is about 30 miles outside of Paris, everybody talks about the Hall of Mirrors. Actually, that's pretty boring. But right next to it, in another hallway, is the Hall of Great Battle Scenes. Now, that is worth seeing. You have these gigantic paintings of battle scenes, and that is something worth looking at. A hallway parallel to the hallway of the Hall of Mirrors. Everybody talks about the Hall of Mirrors, and they need to be cleaned. Let me tell you that you do a better job of cleaning. And I found that very boring. But right next to it is the Hall of Great Battle Scenes, of magnificent paintings of great battle scenes, and that is really fun. So that's what you see in Versailles. Otherwise, just a bunch of rooms where rich people used to live. There's a city called Chartres, and I can't pronounce it right. I think you have to be able to speak French to pronounce it right. I pronounce it Chartres, but I've heard French people pronounce it, and it doesn't sound like that. It's Chartres, I think, and it's a city about 30 miles outside of Paris, and within it is the Great Cathedral. And it is a great cathedral. Now, one of the interesting things about great cathedrals is that they're all different. I mean, you think, oh, well, I saw Notre Dame. What's the point of seeing another cathedral? But amazingly enough, even though they're all built with the same idea behind them, they're all different. Every cathedral has its own individual look about it, and are distinctive. And I can tell you that when you go from one cathedral to the next, you'll always remember which cathedral was which, because they're as much as great as the similarities are, there's just as great as differences. whether it's the ratio of the types of sculptures or whether sculptures are the focus versus stained glass or whatever, they all have their particular individuality, which makes them distinct from every other cathedral. And I guess every place that built a cathedral, which is usually considered the greatest structure within any community, every community wanted to be distinct from every other community, and so therefore they created these structures, which were, even though they all had the same function and the same purpose, were still individually based upon the desires of the community itself. And each community took pride in its own creation. So the more cathedrals you can see, the better, because everyone is different. And you're going to see things in one cathedral you will not see in any other. So they're all distinct and different, and they're all magnificent, and they're all worth seeing. No matter what the guidebook tells you or the tour guide tells you, you see a cathedral or a large church and the door is open, or even if it's not, you walk into it because there'll be something there that's unique to that edifice that you will not see anywhere else. And it would be a sad thing to walk. It would be a sad thing to walk by something that has within it things you're never going to see anywhere else, and to walk by because it's not as famous as Lady Gaga. This is 710 KRV Talkback. Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone, doing a little bit of a travelogue today to break the monotony from government fascism. 10 KRV Talkback. Dr. Lawrence Gelman, home of the Iron Microphone. Streaming live on KURV.com. 1-800-580-8255. 1-800-580-TALK. So we're just talking about traveling around Europe a little bit. It's easy to get around Paris. They have a great metro system. It can take you anywhere you need to go. Don't take the taxi if you can avoid it, because the traffic in the city can be pretty bad. And the trains are very convenient, and they go to a lot of different. They go everywhere you want to go, and they're easy to navigate. They're very easy to navigate. They all have maps in the stations, and the train line is called by its end point. So you have two endpoints on the train on the line, and the line you want to go on is you know which line it is by the sign will have the end point, and then you can know which direction you're going, because if you're going one way, it'll be one end point, and of course if you're going the other way, it is the other end point. And so it's all really pretty straightforward, and the maps are all easy to read, and every station has them, even if you don't have your own little guidebook. Every station has the map, which tells you how to get to wherever you want to go. So from Paris, what you can do is you can take the overnight train to Venice. So you sleep on the train instead of the hotel, so what's the difference? So you take the overnight train to Venice, 8-9 hour ride, whatever it happens to be. And now Venice is a city worth seeing. Everybody has a lot of negative press about about Venice, but it's definitely worth seeing. St. Mark's Square, of course, and the great cathedral there, which is amazing for its mosaic domes. Every cathedral has its own thing, and the thing that stands out in the St. Mark's Cathedral is the gold mosaics, the gold in the domes, and the great art that's there. Walking around Venice is very interesting because it's a city that has a significant amount of its transportation through the canals. But you can get anywhere also by walking. You don't need to go anywhere through the canals if you don't want to. But it is interesting to see a place in where the thoroughfares are water canals versus streets. So the thing to do in Venice, as with most of these old cities, is to walk the streets. during odd hours as well. You can walk the streets early in the morning, walk the streets throughout the day, walk the streets late at night. Even if places are closed, it is still interesting walking down these boulevards or narrow cobblestone pathways that are hundreds and hundreds of years old. And you can try to imagine yourself back in time. And it is much easier to do so when there's not so many people walking. The tourists are still having their breakfasts or have gone to bed for the evening. When you walk the streets at night is when the ghosts of those who have passed on come out. And you can imagine yourself as one of those people who lived way back when, and try to put your mindset into the way those people thought as best you can. Of course, it's all romanticized, obviously, but what the heck? That's what you go on vacation for, isn't it? And so it's interesting to watch the sun set over a city, or the sun rise, and the lights and the shadows as they occur throughout the day as you're walking through the streets. Most of these older cities have narrow cobblestone streets with buildings on either side that tend to block out the sun, so you're walking in the shade or the shadows. But then they have their cathedrals or their squares, and oftentimes there's more than one in a city. They may have a main square, but there's often smaller squares with smaller churches or other commercial enterprises. And so you're walking from the narrow, shaded, shadowy parts into the brightly lit, sun-soaked squares. Which is impressive because that's where usually the cathedral is or other such structure. And so you walk from the darker areas to the well-lit and brightly lit areas, and oftentimes the structures tend to reflect light, so it makes it even seem even more brightly lit, and the differences as you're walking become even greater. So you tend to walk into bursts of light, which I find kind of interesting. And you walk into bursts of light, and you see these great structures before you. Land of Oz. Anyway, so and then you stroll about the town. So in Venice is interesting to stroll about Venice and walking into these squares where there's a church, and then walking into the church, and then looking what's within the church, this architecture, the structure. You walk the paintings, the sculptures, the mosaics, the architecture itself, the arches, the domes, the cupolas, the stained glass windows, the borderings of things, all the carvings in stone and all the carvings in plaster, all the carvings in the marble and stone sculptures, all very interesting to see, amazing works of art, everyone somewhat different from the next, and no two exactly the same, and that's what makes it all so interesting. You're never quite sure what you're going to run into. You walk through the building, you walk to the building on the cobblestone pathways, and you never quite know, unless you've been there before, what you're going to see, and that all makes it so much more interesting and exciting. You don't need to have any special place to go to lunch. If you get a little hungry, you just stop off at a side cafe and order yourself a sandwich and a bottle of water or whatever, a drink, and either sit down on the curb or at a table or eat as you're walking. And it doesn't all need to be all planned to the minute. You can be a little independent and take some time. I remember there was one day, and you never quite know if you're open to a little adventure. I remember one day my wife and I were walking through Florence, and it was in the evening, and my wife is a very religiously oriented person, a very spiritual person, and we're walking by this little church and it was called, I don't know what it was, the Church of Jerusalem, something, I don't know. And for some reason or other, my wife thought she'd like to go in and take a look, even though there was no evidence of anything going on whatsoever. In fact, it looked quite dark and secluded. I mean, nothing much going on. So she walks up the stairs, walks through the doors, and this is one of those churches where the first thing you have is like an inner garden, where you have a walkway going around an inner garden, and everything was dark. There was really no light. There was, to our left, there was a what do you call it, one of those doorways with a frosted glass window, and there was light coming through the glass, but otherwise it was all dark. There were no people. There was nothing. We didn't hear anything, and just this light, this glass with light coming through it, but there was nothing that said mass or nothing which said nobody there to greet us. Nothing. My wife, being the adventuresome soul that she is, she wanted to walk through the door with the light coming through it, and I was, of course, opposed to it because I thought, I'm not even sure we're supposed to be in here because it doesn't look like anything's going on, and it's dark, and there's no lights, and there's nobody here. But we walked through the door, and I saw something that I'd never seen before, never seen since, and it was actually the beginning of a mass. It was a Catholic mass, I imagine, and but there were a small number of people sitting in pews, but the members of the church were all dressed in white robes, and they so there was a platform or the dais where I guess the priests were there behind the podiums, were also dressed in white robes with a hood. They didn't have the hood. Most of them did not have the hood over. They just had it lying back. It was white, and they were just about to start the mass. Now the parishioners were sitting in pews, regular pews as we see all the time, but the other participants in the mass, the nuns, the whoever were actually part of the church, of the organization of the church, they had these low kneeling stools, okay, all up in the front, and that's where they were. I guess the nuns and the other, the deacons, the other priests, whatever. And the mass was done almost entirely through song. The scriptures were done in song. Of course, the choir was all song, and it was really very, very fascinating, seeing all this mass. And we stayed throughout the entire mass. This mass that was done in song, that everybody was singing, and it was really quite beautiful. The responses also in song. Something I've never seen before, never seen since, but I'm just saying, and of course, I am no way able to express it the way it was, but it was really very interesting to see and be part of, because we participated in the Mass, of course. And it just so happened, but the thing is, we just so happened to walk into this place for which there was no announcement or no appearance anything was going on. We just happened to arrive at the beginning of the Mass. And so these are the things that can happen if you allow yourself to have a little bit of an adventuresome type of spirit. And so it was an event I'll always remember, something different, a Mass performed differently than I'd ever seen before or since. At the end, during the greeting parts, the members of the church went and greeted every single parishioner individually. Every single one was given the handshake and the peace. The granting of the peace, or the bestowal of peace, or the blessings of peace on every single one. So it was really very something you might not purposely do, because reading about something like that is nowhere near as interesting as being part of it. But, so walking the streets and going into places that you might maybe not in the guidebook, that you might not otherwise do, and just taking the time to try to immerse yourself into this centuries-old environment I think is part of the interest and fascination of going to places that you've never been before, places that have been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, and then walking through the streets and seeing the structures which people long gone also saw, just as you are seeing now, and it kind of like ties you to them, because I imagine that the emotions that one feels today were similar, if not identical, to the emotions of others that are now long gone. And it kind of ties you to the rest of humanity, even the humanity of a different country and a different language, of a different time than we are today. So I think it is worthwhile for those, and there's really almost anybody can, for those who haven't been to Europe or other places, there's always that little bit of fear of unknown language and unknown place. But they're really, and I mean, I was that way as well, but actually there's no need for that, that they're all people like the rest of us. And there's always a way to get from here to there. There's always a way to get from one place to another, whether it's walking or car or taking the train or flying in a plane. What I like to do personally is drive from one city to the next. I don't drive within a city because most of these cities were not built for driving around. They were built for pedestrian traffic. Not very many cars around back in the 18th, 17th, 16th century. So I was just walking. So I like to do is drive, because a train is nice because it's convenient, but you don't see much of the countryside in a train, usually. Usually the train doesn't go through the prettiest parts of a country or a city. So, I mean, I've done both, but driving is nice because it's leisurely, and you can see a lot of the countryside, and a lot of the country, it is quite something to see. So what I like to do is drive from city to city and then park the car within the city, whether it's at the hotel parking or public parking, and then leaving it there until it's time to go to another city. Driving around these places is a headache and really very inconvenient and very it's usually not something that you really want to do. So you can get to actually see a lot of different places. And if you spend some places, you only need a few hours. Other places, you need more time. But if you can arrange your trip so that there's as much independence as possible, that will make things a lot more fun if you don't actually have to be someplace at a particular time, and can incorporate some independence into the travel. So, which is more easily done if you rent a car, because you can decide when you're going to leave a place, and maybe take little side trips as you're going along and kind of create things, make up things as you go. The roads are easy to traverse, hard to get lost. The signage is usually pretty good. So, and you're going from city to city. So within a city, it's easy to get lost. Going between cities is pretty. You can do that without too much trouble. And so, if anyone has a chance to go and to these places, but if you can go during times of festival, that's always good. For instance, if you want to go to Jerusalem, do so during Easter. If you want to go, or Christmas, I guess. If you want to go to Rome, go during the Christmas season. So I mean, things like that, or other in the places have festivals, particular to the place, and I understand, and that's probably pretty interesting to go at that time. Often though, there's whatever they happen to be, that always is a somewhat I think, more interest. So there's a lot of other places you can go to. There's another thing is that when you're going, what you want is to have some kind of a credit card where you can draw cash. You don't want to go to money exchanges because they either charge a large commission or they give you a bad exchange rate. Those places that say no commission, it's just they give you a bad exchange rate. If you use your ATM machines, you can get the exact exchange rate of the day, and it's for most places that's pretty simple. You may have to inform your credit card company or your bank where you're going to be so they won't think it's an unauthorized charge by somebody who stole your credit card. So it's always good to let them know. Sometimes the PIN needs to change if you go overseas. You may want to know that ahead of time. So if you can have a emergency supply of cash, but try to do your daily spending just by using your ATM card, that's definitely the way to go. Get tickets to the museums beforehand so that you don't have to wait in line. Oftentimes, if you think ahead of time, they're going to be shipped to your home before you actually go, so you'll have tickets in hand. But don't forget them, as I did one time. So make sure you take your tickets with you when you go. What other little... You don't have to spend a lot of money, as we said before, on food or hotels or transportation either. And you don't have to stick to a definite itinerary if you have a little bit of an adventurous type spirit and want to go off the beaten path a little bit. That's also sometimes the most fun of all. Don't be afraid to drive around Europe. No problem there. Sometimes gas stations are few and far in between, and when you go through in these places, always make sure you have plenty of gas. Never count on a gas station around the next curve. Sometimes it's not there or it's not open. What other little tidbits? I don't know. Anyway, so mass transit. Avoid taxis. Use mass transit in most of these cities. Mass transit is very convenient, inexpensive. Once you figure out a little bit, where to pay, how to pay, but usually from getting here to there is pretty straightforward. The maps are usually pretty good. The transit lines are used very frequently, or between cities as well. You can use the train. Very inexpensive, probably less expensive than driving around, but you don't get to see the quite as much scenery, but that really doesn't. I mean, either way, very convenient. Leave every hour throughout the day. So that's trying to think what other little tidbits. You can always get tour guides there. You don't need to arrange that ahead of time. You can always get tour guides there. Even when you're walking someplace, whenever you get someplace, there's always a tour guide. Outside the museums, outside of this place or that place, there's always tour guides around. So you can use them or not, based upon whether you feel like you want to use it or not. So they're always around. The hotel can always get you one if you need one. So it's just things that are fun to do, things which are different, things you don't see every day, and are interesting, and not as daunting as many might think. And and the other thing is, once you've done it once, you're going to want to do it again. And every place is good. You always beat your brains in, do I want to go here? Do I want to go there? And the fact of the matter is that wherever you go is going to be fun. There's fun and interesting things to see pretty much everywhere. You just got to go look for it. And so whether you're going to go see this city or that city, should we go to London? Should we go to Rome? Should we go to Madrid? Well, you can't go wrong, okay? It doesn't matter. Should I go to this little city in Italy or that little city in Italy? You can't go wrong. Every place is going to be interesting. There is no perfect, absolute place that you need to go to. There's lots of great things to experience everywhere. And so there's no reason to beat yourself to death a lot about trying to figure out exactly where you want to go and exactly which day to go and exactly what time to go. Because there's I've never been any place I regretted going to. It's always been fun and interesting. You just have to. So that's then that's wherever it happens to be. There's a lot of interesting things to see. I myself prefer works of man versus acts of nature. Of course, man is nature, but I mean those which tend to be structures built by man versus structures built by non-man nature. I prefer a cathedral to a mountain, and I prefer a museum to a lake, and I prefer a highway to a path through a forest. Not to say there isn't something interesting in paths through forests or mountain ranges or things like that, but I prefer works of man because I find them much more interesting versus the chaos of so much of what is in the world. Anyway, so I guess that's it for today. Protect your gun rights, because the government is the enemy and the gun is your friend, because the gun will be used to defend you. 7 KURV, Talkback, Dr. Gelman will be back next week. Streaming live on KURV.com.